Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Lauren Richmond, your host, and today I'm welcoming Geoff Mitchell to the show. Geoff is senior minister at Linden One Christian Church, where his goal is to help people discover a life that does more than leave them exhausted and disillusioned. A native of Kentucky, Geoff grew up on the Mississippi River in Keokuk, Iowa. He spent 13 years in Texas, earning a Bachelor of Arts in Religion and a Master of Divinity from Texas Christian University. He is currently working on his dissertation to complete his DMin. He has served churches in Fort Worth and Keokuk. He has also started 2 new congregations in Aledo, Texas, and suburban Chicago. Geoff officiates high school football and baseball because he finds it relaxing to be yelled at by parents and coaches. He's on the lifelong journey to find perfect coleslaw and is the last Lyndon Johnson defender left on the earth. As a note to listeners, this episode was recorded live in person at the conference hall of the General Assembly of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, so you'll notice a good bit of background noise through the show. Thanks for listening. All right, hey, this is a special episode of the Future Christian Podcast. I am here in Louisville, Kentucky. This is your host, Lauren Richmond, and I'm here with Disciples of Christ pastor extraordinaire Geoff Mitchell. We're sitting in the lobby of the Louisville Convention Center, Kentucky?
The Kentucky International Convention Center.
Okay, there it is. So, first of all, Geoff, thanks for your time. Appreciate you being here. Looking forward to having this conversation.
I appreciate that.
So, listeners, please forgive the ambiance. It's kind of a little dead right now.
We're skipping a business session. We're actually in a Bible study right now, so we're skipping Bible study to come record this.
Yeah. Well, let's first start off by tell our listeners just a little about you, your faith journey, that kind of thing.
I have been a disciple since the day I have a joke. You're not born into the disciples, you're baptized into the disciples. But I was born with parents that were members of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, baptized at a young age, right here in Louisville, actually, at Fairview Christian Church when I was in 2nd grade. And my family lineage on my dad's side goes back in the disciples as far as we can track. And so I'm not saying that we were at Cane Ridge, but we probably had family within spitting distance of that that came over with Daniel Boone and the Transylvania Company, settled there in central Kentucky. So we have long roots in the disciples. But for me, I grew up in Iowa as of my formative years, came to faith. Faith became my own through church camp, through youth group. Very active in my church that I grew up at, First Christian Church in Keokuk, where my dad was the pastor for many years. And by the time I was a senior in high school, I had come to grips with what I kind of had known to be true since junior high, which God was calling me to ministry. I stuttered. I have no social skills. I never knew what to do in a crowd, personally and as well as speaking. Yeah. And God's like, "You're going to be a minister." And I was like, "Oh my gosh." Yeah. And so I got on the path as soon as I could because I knew I had so much to learn. Went to college at TCU, was a religion major, barely graduated, was barely accepted, and then I confirmed that by barely graduating. And then went straight into Bright and have 2 degrees from TCU.
Yeah, awesome. So one fun fact about Geoff is Geoff hosts the Frogcast?
The Frogcast, yes. Podcast? I am a TCU football degenerate. Everybody's a fan. Oh, I got a T-shirt, or I watched the playoff game. I know the sophomores and the juniors that their defensive back coaches are looking at.
Wow.
And I care a little too much about that. But everybody, this is my cop out. I remember going to one of those healthy boundary training classes or this or that. And they said, you should have something you're really passionate about and you're really good about that has absolutely nothing to do with men.
That's
not church.
My problem. My whole passion is church, I think.
I get that. Yeah. I used to read like Rick Warren and Herb Miller books in college. Yeah. And you're probably too young to know who Herb Miller was, but he was Rick Warren before Rick Warren.
Yeah.
And so I'm a church dork. I'm a church nerd, but college football is my passion. TCU football is my passion.
I have to talk a little trash then, because being from Colorado,
yes,
we're all excited about Coach Prime.
Who's that?
Come on.
Oh, Deion Sanders. That's right. I forgot that.
Coach Prime.
Yes.
Yeah. So share, if you would, just kind of a little bit about what's like, I always like to ask guests, what's like a spiritual practice that's meaningful for you might recommend to others?
That is meaningful for me that I would recommend for others.
Or it could just be meaningful for you.
Okay. Well, this will be kind of targeted. I get that people that listen to this are probably church nerds like us.
Yeah.
I have probably in the last year or so developed this habit of reading the New Testament continuously with only one rule, that nothing I read or receive can be used in a sermon. And so I realized I had a deficiency of time with Scripture because I was like, oh, that'll preach. Or, oh, there's my next sermon series. Or, oh, wait a minute, let me wrestle with this issue.
Yeah.
I want to be a disciple of Jesus that spends time dwelling in the Word, that doesn't immediately have a pivot to, oh my gosh, how can I turn this into a 5-week series? Or, I got this funny joke that fits in right there and I got the sermons done.
Right.
And so I just want to be, and I don't have the best contemplative practices. I don't feel like that makes me an awful Christian. I just acknowledge a deficiency there.
Sure.
I dwell with God in Scripture.
Yeah.
And I think this new backstop of this dwelling with God is just for Geoff to be with God and not for Geoff to be with the Bible to get a sermon. And they can overlap. I am nourished through study and reflection to prepare for a sermon, but it's preparing for a sermon.
Interesting. So you kind of make that delineation. I know, one of, I think, the things that I've noticed over my ministry career, and that's for me going all the way back to Bible college 20 years ago, was some contexts will delineate between Scripture for study and then Scripture for personal devotion. So for me, I've really never found a difference, but it sounds like for you, that's been a helpful delineation.
That has been helpful for me because I have the attention span of a gnat.
Yeah.
And so if I'm studying a text to preach, I'm like, well, let's look at every other translation. Let's look at how does NRSV say this versus the ESV versus the NIV. And I go, oh my gosh, let me go to this list of scholars. It's just the Bible in the morning. There's nothing else. I even read a Bible that has basic on my Kindle. I do it on my Kindle, ironically. And you got to hyperlink to the footnotes. So I can't even look at the footnotes. It's just me and the text.
Interesting. Well, thanks for sharing that. Appreciate you sharing that. So I had Geoff on, Geoff in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, this convention. I don't know if I said that right for our listeners. We're at the convention, the General Assembly of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ here in Kentucky. And Geoff, is a veteran Disciples of Christ pastor, started a couple of churches. Geoff, I know I've heard you on other podcasts talking about church starting efforts in the denomination.
Yes.
Something that I'm passionate about, having started church myself. And a lot of what I talk about on the podcast is new churchy type stuff, church revitalization. And then I think both of us, we'd probably agree, like we're interested in revitalization within the denomination as a whole. So talk, maybe just start off with like your kind of experience starting churches.
Oh my gosh. So in the fall of 99, we're going back 24. I know. I don't appreciate that. In the fall of 99, I was halfway through seminary at Bright Divinity School, and Danny Couch, who was the pastor at Central Christian Church in Weatherford, which was 15, 20 miles west of Fort Worth, called me at the little church I was serving as a student pastor in the worst named city in the world, White Settlement, Texas.
Oh my God.
In this Bethany Christian Church. They're lovely people.
Right.
And I think they were the first integrated church in White Settlement. So they're lovely people. I was serving there preaching and having a good time. And Danny called and said, I want to start a new church in Aledo, which was 15 miles out.
Okay.
He said, I've been collecting people that are interested in starting a disciples church. And he says that, they can't, go hire a full-time minister. But I think if you came here and worked with them, they could be your graduation and their viability could overlap.
Yeah.
And I came there and we did.
Right.
And so I was young. I was so young. I think I was 24 when I started this church. I had nothing but my ignorance and my passion, both of which were probably needed.
Right.
I did so many things wrong. I was not a differentiated leader, not a non-anxious presence.
Love me some family systems.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I loved Jesus and I wanted to preach. And I wanted to see new people come to faith.
Right.
I wanted to see new people come to faith. I know we don't talk about that enough.
We don't.
We don't talk about that enough. And I wanted to see people baptized.
Yeah.
I want to see people baptized, become followers of Jesus, become apprentices of his way, which is you're initiated into a relationship with Christ, initiated into the way of the cross.
Yeah.
And I wanted to see that happen.
Yeah.
I had no clue how to do it, but that was my dream. And so we got up off the ground. I was there 7 or 8 years, enjoyed it. It was difficult. I don't want to say I burned out, but I didn't have much left to give.
You spent a lot of gas in the tank.
I spent a lot of gas in the tank. Here's some things I learned that I think almost all these people have passed now, so I can say it. It's the worst possible way to start a church.
Oh?
We had 10 people that were all disciples that wanted to start a disciples church.
Yes.
And so all we were doing was trying to multiply our terrible DNA.
Yes. Sort of like what was shared last night, I think, in the message, right?
I think that's accurate.
That same language.
Yes.
For listeners, check out...
We had a board before...
Dr. Yolanda Norton. But anyway, continue.
We had a board and governance structure before we had any theological justification for our existence. We had great financial procedures, which is great.
Great.
We had no clue what to do when someone came in and said, "I'd like to know God in a deeper way."
Yes.
And that,
man. Yeah.
But there's a beauty in that. We're all stupid. I mean, God only calls foolish people to do these things.
Amen.
And so it was a fast growing suburb. It was honestly, we were the most liberal church in town, and nobody in our church called themselves liberal. Like they were all old yellow dog conservative Democrats. Or George. I mean, this was the time of George W. Bush's presidency. Yeah. They were Bushites, which in Texas at that time now would make you liberal, but back then it was like really conservative. And we were the open-hearted church. We were judgmental. And that was kind of part of our branding, for lack of a better term, which it has some real positives and also can cut your legs out from underneath you as well. Like, why do we even exist?
Yeah, right.
We exist for us to be able to do anything. Well, then why do I need you?
Right.
So I started a church there. Ended up going back to my home church in Iowa, which is a whole nother story, and had this dramatic experience of growth. Took a established church of about 300 people. When I left, we were about 900 in worship every week. And I was just talking about this at lunch. I had this terrible combination of ambition and faithfulness. Yeah. And those, they say don't cross the streams in Ghostbusters. I think those streams may have crossed there. And I left all of that to move to Chicago to start a new church from scratch in a city where I knew no one. Yeah. And can we confess sin on here? Is that all right?
Sure. That's Nadia Bolt-Weber's podcast, but sure, you can do it here.
I was talking at the time when I was discerning that call to one of my dear mentors and friends. He hates when I call him my mentor. He says we're peers, but he's my mentor. David Emery, Harvard Avenue Christian Church.
Yeah, trying to get David on the pod.
In Tulsa.
Tell him we need to work on something.
I will. He has half the attention span that I do.
Yeah, I believe it.
And I love him.
I've talked to him a little bit, and I got that.
Yeah, he's always on 1.8 speed.
Yes.
So I'm talking to David, and I'm like, David, we're in this town of 10,000, and I've grown this church from 300 to 900. We had over 1,500 people on Easter. Imagine what we can do if we go to this big booming suburb in Chicago. Right. And he's like, Geoff, you are so wrong. He's like, you did not grow that church. Yeah. God grew that church.
Holy Spirit.
And you preach Jesus, and that's what, I think, I love that text. If you lift me up, I will draw everyone to myself. Right. That's not just like lift high the cross on the top of the steeple, but announce the gospel. Right. I'm enough of a Calvinist. The gospel is irresistible. I believe that.
Look at you. Okay.
I believe
save that for later.
I'm not a Calvinist.
Okay.
But I do believe in total depravity, and I do believe that grace is irresistible.
Okay.
But I don't.
This is not a theology podcast. So we'll save that for later.
Well, I'm definitely not a theologian. Just go ask my GPA. Moved to Chicago and started Big Life Community Church in Oswego, Illinois. And we were a disciples church that did not put disciples in the name, did not put a chalice
Maybe we should talk about that more.
Oh my gosh, did I get frowns.
You can cuss on this podcast.
I don't want to cuss. I caught a lot of flack. Yeah. And looking back on it, I think maybe they were right. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think if I were to say they were right, it was that I was really stuck on the idea that if we just did these 5 things that amounted to technical change.
Yeah.
Brand your name better.
Right.
Have a lot, we've got
Better
coffee,
messaging.
better messaging,
Better coffee.
better branding,
Better music.
better music. We're, you can wear shorts to church. That's the problem with the world right now.
Right.
And I bought in on all of that.
Yeah.
And in spite of that, the Holy Spirit worked.
Right.
We probably baptized about 100 people in 8 years.
Wow.
At that church.
Yeah.
Probably 80% of them adults.
Yeah.
And what I do give gratitude to God for is, in a sense, that was our mission. We were like, we had 3 values that we said every week in church.
Right.
Number 1 was we exist to share Jesus with people that don't go to church.
Right.
Every single person in our church could recite that. It might as well have been our creed. We exist to share Jesus with people that don't go to church.
Your overarching narrative. Yeah.
We welcome everyone.
Right.
And we believe that God deserves better.
Hmm.
And so you had evangelism, discipleship, and welcome all blending together there. Yeah. And ended up leaving there and accepting a call from starting a new church that met in a in a Knights of Columbus hall that we bought that smelled like guilt and cigarettes. And remodeled that. And accepted a call to a 175-year-old church in the heart of the Deep South.
Wow.
At Lindenwood Christian Church in Memphis. Wow. That's where I am today.
That's quite a lot there. So
I know, I got to catch my breath.
Let's maybe go at it from this way. Like, there's not a lot happening. Maybe I'll say it this way. I don't see a lot happening nationally with church start in our denomination. I think we would both agree, at least from what I've heard from you otherwise, that starting new churches is essential for growth, bringing in new disciples. I don't mean disciples of Christ. I mean disciples of Jesus.
Yes. And disciples of Christ. I'm cool with that too.
Yeah,
I'm cool with
sure,
that.
as long as they're disciples of Jesus first and foremost.
Yes.
So, like, what? I guess maybe there's really 2 ways to go about this. We can talk practically, but I'm curious more philosophically from you. Like, what do you think? Like, if you were, I often ask this question.
Yeah.
To listeners, or excuse me, to guests at the end, like, if you were Pope for a day, what would you want to do?
For a day.
So if you were GMP for listeners, General Minister and President of the denomination for a day or for a week, and you wanted to, like, let's say, focus on church planting, what are like 3 initiatives you'd be like, let's do this?
Oh, man. Well, let me start with this.
Yeah.
We have a common friend, Dennis Sanders.
Right.
I've told him this numerous times when he is expressing his angst about our denomination, which he and I share.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think it's the job of the denomination to do jack squat on starting new churches.
Okay.
I were Pope if I was
GMP,
if I was all powerful for a day, which the GMP is not.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I would get in one room the pastors of our 50 most dynamic churches.
Yeah.
And said, look, I need all of you to start a new church.
Yeah.
And my job would be to be a spiritual encourager and a bully.
Yeah.
To get them to multiply.
Right.
Because it would be in a way that it would be an outgrowth of their existing faith habits in a location that is within that they have a partnership.
So, because what like multi-site,
it could be multi-site.
Could be like
churches started churches,
taking 50, 100, 20, 200 people. Going to
it all
church.
has the same.
Right.
So it's an outgrowth of what's already strong.
Right.
Let me tell you what I would not do.
Yeah.
I would not go hit up a donor for $50 million and get 50 new churches, $1 million to start a new church somewhere where we don't have disciples.
Okay.
That is terrible.
Okay, let's talk through that.
I have parachute. We used to call it parachute.
Right.
We're going to drop, let's think about that metaphor for a second. We're going to push you out of the airplane. And if you can't be self-sustaining, you're going to hit the ground and die.
And I can speak to testimony that, yes.
Is that not a terrible metaphor?
Having experienced that, yes.
Yes. And so what I would not do is camp out on this myth that you need to go to a place you've never been. The clock is running on your funding.
Right.
And when your clock is running on your funding, you begin to make compromises.
Right. Because let me jump in here.
No, this is my podcast. You can't talk.
Geoff, geez. In my experience, that was one of the struggles that I was aware of immediately, was that the metric that I was held accountable to was really financial sustainability. And my my non-clergy leaders would say, hey, what about this? What about this? And I'd be like, that's great. But what the powers that be
Yes.
want to know is, are you financially sustainable?
Yes. That's what they want to know.
Yeah.
And that's not a terrible question.
Sure.
And as one of the token flaming capitalists left in our denomination, I do believe
Okay.
that we need to fund our mission.
Sure.
And, And I believe in stewardship with all of my heart.
Right.
But starting churches is
Yeah.
more biblical
Yeah.
than, and I think it's healthier. It's much healthier because once you start one, you're much more likely to start a second. And I say all of this knowing that I now serve one of the churches that would be in that room. And I am beginning to plant seeds of that conversation. I've talked about it in the podcast.
Let me bring this practically speaking, because one of the things that I noticed, like, again, as a kind of a parachute drop-in, like when I'm like, oh, I need a stapler. Like little stupid stuff like, oh, I need a stapler. I need somewhere to print. I need an office.
Yeah.
You know, those kind of little things that you don't think about starting a church. Like, an existing church would have all that infrastructure in place.
And they would also have healthy DNA in place.
Right.
They would also be like, all right, we know how to do worship.
Right.
It would be an expansion of what is already vital and healthy. But having spent time leaning on pastors of larger churches in the past, there is still a theology of scarcity with a church with a $1.5 million budget.
Well, and especially, I imagine, it's like, well, I want to keep my big crowd.
I think that's part of it. I think my hunch is to be more resources.
Okay.
And they'd say, I can't lose these 10 people.
Yeah, that's fair.
You know.
That's fair. So, let's go about it this way too. Like, what do you see that's happening in our kind of movement that you're a fan of? You kind of talk about what you're not a fan of. What are you a fan of?
Well, let me go back to what they originally called the decam called the 2020 vision.
Right. Okay.
That one of the pillars was that we would be a church that started 1,000 new churches by 2020. And we did it.
Okay.
We started 1,000. Now, we don't have 1,000 more churches. Not every church made it.
Right.
The church I started in Texas is no longer open after
COVID.
COVID.
Is no longer open.
But I don't care about that.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I care about putting 400,000 through the paper shredder.
Right.
You know, we can be good I pulled that out of my head. But I don't care that they didn't work because I want to we serve a God that allows for us to not do everything right. And I would rather honor that faith and that risk in a wise way than be so timid and say, oh, the last time we tried it didn't work. Let's never do it again.
Yeah.
So what I'm excited about within those 1,000 new churches that we started, I used to have the numbers off my head, but at my age, at 48, I'm forgetting. I know over 50% of them were non-white. I think it might have been 75.
Wow.
A vast majority of them. And so this is where God's humor is intact and on display. I was in the room when they started talking about we should start 1,000 churches by 2020. It was looked at as this is going to save the disciples.
Right.
We're going to get more suburban churches. We're going to get more healthy.
Right.
We look at churches like Creekwood and North Dallas and Geist that were started in the previous, vision of starting. Those are great churches. We need more churches like that. But when you start immigrant churches that meet in a community room in an apartment complex and still have 150 people, they're not going to come to the General Assembly and spend $1,800 out of their own pocket to sit out in the hallway like you and I are right now.
Yeah, chit-chatting here.
And it was not fuel into the existing understanding of what it meant to be a discipleship minister. It was not. It did not fuel the institution.
Yeah.
Now, what I do know is it fueled mission in ministry, and our church on paper is much more diverse than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It is not more diverse than in that room that I'm pointing at across the podcasting is not a visual medium. It's not a visual medium. And so I'm excited about hundreds and hundreds of new churches that most people don't know about that are non-white, that are reaching people that we were not able to reach before. And I don't know how God will use all that in the future, but the joke I always was told by Hispanic pastors when I lived in Texas is we start an immigrant church where everybody speaks Spanish. Their children speak Spanish and English. And then the grandchildren, they only speak English. And how does God utilize all of that to continue to grow our witnesses, disciples? I don't know. But I'm grateful that the faith was passed on that way.
Now, when we were talking about setting this interview up, we were talking a little bit, and you mentioned, because again, I'm also a church nerd, and you mentioned 2 churches in town, is it, that were Baptist churches?
Yes.
That Alexander Campbell, for the real church nerds here, brought into this
I've
movement.
done a little more research.
Okay, go.
Philip Slater Fall brought First Christian into First Christian, I believe.
Okay.
That's what I was able to.
But go with that story.
And Alexander Campbell, I don't know if it was Alexander Campbell, but Beargrass Christian Church used to be Beargrass Baptist Church.
Okay, in Louisville.
And these are two healthy, vital churches.
Mm-hmm.
And that was actually common in this area,
okay,
where a Campbellite evangelist would come in and basically hijack a Baptist church and say, hey, we got it right over here. And a lot of the seeds of disciples' growth were churches that left the Baptist Association to become Campbellites, take on Christian, and then they became the incubation center for missionaries heading west from here. And so when I was at this, sitting around the table of we used to call it the New Church Leadership Team, and we'd have so many Hispanic churches that were independent, that wanted to affiliate.
Right.
They're like, we love disciples. We love their thing. We want to be in your church. And there was can we speak freely on here?
Sure. Yeah.
There was so much white liberal elitist pushback on these people are not really disciples.
Right.
They don't worship they don't use inclusive language every week. How can they even love Jesus?
As someone who joined into the disciples, again, if you're disciples and you're listening, I don't ever want to hear what generation disciple you are.
Yes.
Don't want to hear that.
No.
Ever.
I promise Jesus doesn't care.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think the great irony is the voices that were loudest for racial inclusion, of which I want to be aligned with, were often those that were the most suspicious / curious of who are all these new churches that are coming in. They're just Pentecostals affiliating with the disciples, so we can give them a tax, ID number or whatever.
Yeah.
And Rick Morris, who's retired now, that ran New Church for forever. He said that there was someone that had written an article about basically their suspicion of, and he said he never stopped hearing about that. Every time he'd go out and meet with a regional new church committee, well, I've heard they're not even real disciples.
Yeah.
And I would argue that is racist.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what was I going to ask you? Like, what do you think is like this was going to ask you. Let's talk about a little bit about the economics around church planting.
Yes, good call.
You've talked a little bit about the kind of the parachute model. Some of the challenges that is you really need someone who can get funded.
Yep.
Because if you're a church leader, you're a pastor, and you or your family is getting dropped into a location, you might not necessarily have the income immediately yourself to sustain your family or yourself. So obviously it's something that I'm well aware of because this was a challenge for me. But one of my learnings, I think, was, at least in my context, like you really have to be bivocational some way.
Yes.
I mean, what are your thoughts around, and I should add too, like, I guess part of my privilege, right, is like, because of my race and gender, probably was more likely to get funding than, like you mentioned, like an immigrant, pastor. So talk through maybe some of those challenges.
Well, when I moved to start the church in Chicago, we were funded in a heavy way from the Christian Church Illinois and Wisconsin, of which to this day I have deep gratitude for. They were amazing. Scott Woolridge, Teresa DeWilliam Parker, regional staff, Crystal Williams, all amazing people, all who believed in what we were doing. Even as they made a massive financial investment into this project. 2 years later, I realized it needed to be 3 times as much.
It's not enough.
And they did serious work.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the same thing.
Serious funding.
Same thing.
As much as anything they'd ever done.
Yeah.
Of which I'm, to this day, grateful for. And so when I think about the economics of it, it comes to 2 things. One is what I said earlier, strong church starts strong church.
Yeah.
And that we should be leaning on our large church pastors to do that. The last half of my time in Chicago, I was bivocational. I just didn't even realize it. We had a rough summer one year.
Right.
And I started officiating high school sports.
Yeah.
Which I love.
Done that.
And I did that. I started umpiring in 7th grade because I couldn't hit a baseball.
Yeah.
And so I put my toe in the water doing football I'm kind of like Forrest Gump. Sometimes I just bump into the oddest people. I bumped into the guy that basically runs the officiating union. It's not a union, but it's more mobbed up than a union. And I got to know
Trust
Tom.
me, I officiate High School Sports, so I can vouch for that.
This is Chicago.
Yeah.
So I got to know Tom Hug, and Tom Hug got me on I was making a housing payment and car payment off of officiating.
Yeah.
And that paid some, but there were months that I didn't necessarily need to do it, but man, I'd go out there on a Saturday and do 4 baseball games in the heat. And these are like travel tournaments for jackass dads. Yeah. And you're getting yelled at for like.
So that part is not fun.
That part is not fun. But I'll tell you what, I loved officiating in high school. I did all the JV football so I could do Friday night. Right. Friday night was a blast. Right. Freshman JV game where it's 58-0 at halftime. Not good. Yeah. So I was bivocational. So my part of my encouragement to anyone starting a new church is find a way that you can have the freedom and the courage to start the church as you feel God is calling you to, that is not dependent. Your entire economic well-being is not dependent on it.
I assume you're familiar with Tom Rainer.
Yes.
Yeah. And I know for our listeners, he's Southern Baptist. So you're welcome to disregard this next 30 seconds if you feel that strongly about it. But one of the things he has said when I've listened to him, and I think it's very prudent, is it's much easier to start bivocational and then go full-time than the reverse.
Yeah, it's always seemed like, it feels like a defeat.
Right. Because I know that was one of the challenges that I was wrestling with is, well, can I move to bivocational? And frankly, living in the Denver metro, off what I was making quote unquote full time was I was essentially being paid part time. Yeah. Working full time. But that's another conversation.
Can I make a joke about Denver?
Sure.
Years ago, I'd interviewed with a very healthy, large church in Denver. And they told me what we were pretty deep. They're like, we need to know this is our salary ranges. Right. And it's, it's not hard numbers. Right. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe somebody's going to pay me. And then I looked at how much houses cost. Yeah. But I was like, it's almost twice what I'm making now, and it's basically a pay cut. Right. Right. $650,000 for a house smaller than the one I was living in at the time. Yeah. And this was pre-COVID. Yeah. Yeah. So, I guess that's just, reality of, I mean, what else do you think? I'm a polyamorous when it comes to ecclesiology. Okay. So
you're not like disciples church has to be organized this way.
No. I love house churches. Yeah. I love missional churches. I love attractional churches. I love mega churches. Yeah. I love any expression. Right. You just have to accept they're not all funded the same way. Okay. And they don't all have the same expectations.
About that. What then? Because again, that gets kind of into the questions of, who gets what funding? If there is funding available, who gets what?
Well, I love operating on the assumption there is no funding. Okay. Let's just start with that. Okay. Yeah. There is no funding. Yeah. And if there is no funding and you want to start a larger, you want to start a church that has 200 people in it.
Like a more traditional Sunday morning
experience. You got a band, you got a screen, you got Bible studies throughout the week in homes. Get a larger church behind you to multiply. Yeah. That is the direction to go on that front. David Fitch teaches at Northern Seminary in Chicago. Okay. Brilliant ecclesiologist. He's a great guy. You should follow him if you don't. Okay. He has all kinds of contrarian thoughts on church planting. He says, if you want to start a church in Chicago today, you should be a plumber. Yeah. He said, you got health care. Yeah. You can work 30 hours a week. And then this is what he said that I loved. He goes, and then you have just enough time left to only do what matters. Right. Isn't that brilliant?
That is smart.
Because my gosh, when I've been in this spot where you're out there and you got like 60 people coming to your church on Sunday. Right. And they're not like dying for a pastoral care call.
Especially younger demographics.
You can just focus on discipling people. Right. You can just focus on growing people. You can focus on building relationships. Right. And I love Fitch's model. And so if I was starting a house church, a dinner church, missional church, and you wanted to have, adequate time to do the work God has called you to do, as well as some sense of economic security, get a trade. Yeah. Don't be a nurse. Don't be a teacher. Yeah. Get a trade. And get into a good union.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, frankly, the job that I have now, I'm working for public housing.
Okay.
It's very much a 9-to-5 job.
Mm-hmm.
It has good benefits. The only negative about my job is that it's pretty like compassion oriented.
Yeah.
So like I find myself at the end of the day, like especially as an introvert, not having a ton of compassion energy. But I think those kind of jobs are very much 9-to-5 jobs, or you set 30 hours a week.
Mm-hmm.
Can be the direction forward.
So when you worked at public housing in Denver, is that for all the people that make less than $400,000? They have to find a place to live. My brother-in-law.
Sadly, I wish, can I get an apartment here?
My brother-in-law, my sister's husband, he's the only one of all the 4 siblings and spouses that doesn't have a college degree.
Mm-hmm.
And he is a union plumber. Who do you think makes the most?
Yeah.
He runs laps around all of those.
Wow. So, I mean, how much we could spend another 45 minutes talking about this.
We could spend another 45 minutes.
I'm just looking at time.
I want to tell you something when you're ready.
Okay. Well, one quick thing I do want to say is, do we need to reconsider when we're thinking about salary realities? Do we need to stop demanding people go to seminary to lead a church? Because would we be better served finding someone from church camp who's passionate about Jesus, say go get a trade, give them some certification classes maybe at our theological schools, and then commission them is our word. Commission them to go start a church.
Just like I believe in a variety of ways to be church, I believe there's the pathways of ministry have to change. We
need wider pathways, you're saying.
We need more. My favorite story to tell about this is you go to, before everybody had self-checkout, I used to go to Walmart on a Saturday morning, and there's 40 of us in line and 1 lane open.
Right.
What do they need to do? They got to open more lanes. We need more lanes for people to accept a call into ministry.
Right.
We need more lanes for people to start new churches.
Yeah.
And I think those two things are going to go together. The more lanes we have for ministry, the more ways that people can start new churches.
Yeah.
So I am as entrenched in the disciples' theological system as possible. I have a religion degree from TCU and a master's of divinity from
For
Bright.
our listeners who are not familiar, he's as about disciple as you can get. Maybe if you went to Barton College and then, I don't know.
Well, I'll put it this way.
Yeah.
The first one is not hyperbole. The second one is.
Yeah.
TCU religion department. I got a much better theological education as an undergrad in the religion department at TCU than anybody will get at any divinity school.
Wow. Okay.
I learned more in that. I slept half the time through seminary because it was I learned all this.
Yeah.
And I learned all this.
Yeah.
And TCU and Bright's a great seminary because I went there.
Right. Of course it is. Of course. Okay. You were going to say something.
Let me make sure. Hold on. I'm going to do what they always do, tell you not to do. I'm going to try to find a quote.
Okay.
I'm going to try to find a quote, and I want to make sure I get it right.
Let's keep filling some time here
Let's
while
keep
you're
filling
finding
some
the quote.
time. Yes. You keep filling time there.
Well, I'll share the story while you're looking.
Yes.
I served at UCC church, my first kind of lead solo pastor gig at a seminary. And there was a young man who was 18 who was a good guy. And his mom was like, oh, he could be interested in this. But I knew he was not college material. I mean, no disrespect to him. He was not seminary material. He didn't have the academic prowess. And I was disappointed.
I got in on what was disciples affirmative action.
Okay.
In the pejorative.
Yeah.
In the pejorative.
But I was like,
I believe in affirmative.
There's no path for ministry. When I was growing up Baptist.
Yeah.
There was, and I shouldn't say there's because there exists somewhere in the mainline world apprentice models for ministry, but it's not enough, I don't think.
No. Tom First, he's the pastor of First United Methodist in Memphis.
Okay.
He also had been a church planner.
Mm-hmm.
His quote, "The problem with mainline Protestantism is not our progressive ethics. It's that we're boring and we're bored with Jesus."
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't need any more boring churches.
No.
And if you're bored with Jesus and you do not believe that his life, death, and resurrection is the most pivotal event in all of human history, do not plant a church.
Appreciate it.
Because you can only plant a church by the power of the resurrection.
Yeah.
And if we are not dependent on a power larger than ourselves to see life, I can't change anybody's lives.
Yeah.
Only the gospel changes people's lives.
Yeah.
I can't plant a church.
No.
Only the gospel plants a church. If you are not transformed and want to share that experience of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, please do not plant a church. I would tell you don't even go to seminary. I would tell you don't go serve an established church.
David, Geoff, that's going to get us in trouble, but 100% agree.
I like Alan Hirsch. You've ever read Alan Hirsch?
I don't think I have.
He's got a book called Forgotten Ways. You need to read it.
Yeah, I do.
He has this phrase I love that was, Christology shapes missiology, which shapes ecclesiology.
Yeah.
And if you don't begin with Christology, then we get it backwards, which is, here is my understanding of what a church does and why it exists. And it's often a self-serving interest.
Man, do we have another 45 minutes here?
We find some mission.
Right.
That we can feel good about. And then the last part is we have a little scrap of Jesus down here at the end.
So if I'm hearing you right, because I think this is a trend right now in mainline circles, is let's go start an NGO.
Yes.
Let's go start a nonprofit.
God bless them.
God bless them.
If God has asked you to do that,
sure,
that is fine. But maybe I have too narrow of an ecclesiology. Those things can be outgrowths of the mission of the church. But if it's an outgrowth of the mission of the church, then it's an outgrowth of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Amen. Yeah.
And if you don't have a passion to see people baptized and renewed by the power of the gospel, do not start a church, because there's a high likelihood you're going to burn out even if you believe in the power of the gospel.
Amen.
Do not go start a new church.
Yeah.
And social services are essential to governmental and communal well-being.
Right.
It is not the church.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've covered some ground here. Let's take a quick break.
Yes, let's do that.
All right. We're back with Geoff Mitchell. Geoff, thanks so much for your time here.
Oh, yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Really appreciate the conversation. So I do this lighting round all the time with people.
Let's do it.
And I don't have the notes right in front of me, so we're just winging this. And I just realized, this is a terrible spot.
We're right across from the bathroom.
Right across from the bathrooms. I've had this nice little booth that we picked out, and I thought it'd be great. And then,
it's a metaphor. Our church is going down the drain.
It's a metaphor. Oh, my goodness.
Bless your heart.
Hopefully anyway, okay, so I'm going off the top of my head here. I asked you this question. Let me ask you it again. If you're Pope for a day,
yes,
you can take these questions as seriously or not as you like to.
Okay.
What do you want to do with that day? Pope for a day.
If I'm Pope for the day, I want to gather the church for one purpose, and it was to pray that God would do something in our churches that can only happen if God makes it happen.
Man, that's good.
That we would have zero strategizing, to-do lists, whiteboard imaginations, that we would just beg the Holy Spirit to move in fresh and powerful ways.
That's good. I'm trying to remember these off the head of my head. If you could bring anybody back to life from the, Christian theological tradition.
Oh, wow.
Who do you want to either meet or bring back to life?
I'd really like to meet Walter Scott.
Okay.
Everybody talked about, or people say that he clearly had some mental health issues. That he was clearly, that he could have possibly been bipolar.
Oh. And
that he had this bad habit of just giving all of his money away. Like Alexander Campbell would give him money, and then he'd just go find, this poor community and hand it to him. So I love people that are just a little off center. And he was, a renowned evangelist. And I'd love to meet Walter Scott. I'd love to follow and be discipled and mentored by Walter Scott.
Interesting. That's good. That's good. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Man.
I know I usually give these questions in advance, so I'm making you work here.
We have amazing values that our world needs. And we have possibly some of the worst delivery of them.
Yeah. You're talking about the denomination.
Yeah. Oh, I thought that's what you were asking.
Yeah. No, that's fine.
Yeah.
I mean,
I also think
situated here contextually.
I think 40 years from now, people are going to look back at this time the way that I looked back at the 60s, which I did, the late 60s.
Yeah.
But the Vietnam War and assassination of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. Senior. I just want to go on the record about senior. Of civil rights movement, of civil rights legislation, of just how people, I look back at that as it had to be one of the most turbulent times.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I think people are going to look back at us having gone through the election of 16 and 20, the pandemic,
the
murder of George Floyd, the attack on the Capitol, January 6th. And whatever this next election is going to look like. And say wow, how did they get through that?
Yeah.
And I guess looking back, I want the question to be not how did I change the world, but how was I faithful with what I was entrusted with?
That's good. That's good. Pull up some notes here. What do you hope? I don't know, maybe let's just contextualize this here, Geoff.
Yes.
Again, we're sitting here at the General Assembly of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. What do you hope for the future of this denomination?
I hope that we let some things die, and I hope that we don't let them die because we think we can build something better. There are some things that just come
Need to die.
end.
Yeah.
Church camp is dying.
Yeah.
Church camp is on hospice.
Right.
There are friends that I'm eating and sharing a drink with at this assembly that are on the list of the 3 to 4 most important people in my life. And I met them at church camp.
Yeah.
There are people that were some of the most formative members of the formative people of my soul that led me through church camp.
Yeah. I mean, from the beginning, you talked about church camp.
Yeah.
So it's not.
It's over.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's over.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean close it today.
Right.
But at this moment, we are managing the decline towards hospice, towards death. And I also hope that we don't just stick all this religious language on things that are dying and say like, well, it's dying, but we're going to see what God brings up next.
Yeah.
Maybe we just, the part of I love about the creed, crucified, dead, and buried.
Yeah.
Like they went out of their way to make sure Jesus died.
Yeah.
And on Saturday, nobody's sitting around saying, all right, here we go. Tomorrow is the big day.
Yeah.
I think you have to let it die and grieve before there's room for resurrection.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of our church that I love and have served and benefited from that is dying. And if we don't give the space to say that and cry, then we don't have room for resurrection.
Right.
I was talking to my therapist about that the other day. Just like freaking church camp was the most important thing of my teenage years.
Yeah.
And it's over.
Yeah.
And it's nobody's fault.
Right.
It's nobody's fault.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like the way that I feel about full-time vocational ministry.
Yes.
Like, I mean, like you, Geoff, I went a different route because I came from a different tradition, but I went to Bible college 4 years to commit myself to ministry.
Yep.
I deconstructed before deconstructing was cool.
Yeah.
I was introduced to disciples, committed myself to seminary, and then I get a seminary and like, oh shit, it's really hard to find a job that supports my family.
It is.
And in the last 6 months, I recently made the decision, like full-time vocational ministry is, and I found myself very much grieving that, like my sole identity, and I shouldn't say my sole identity, but one of my big identities is I can say like, I'm a pastor.
Yes.
Now I have to say I'm a social worker / pastor / podcaster.
Yeah.
And I've noticed like grieving that. So I think it is important to do that. Well, Geoff, appreciate your time today.
Oh, yeah.
Where can folks connect with you? Where's the Fraudcast for the fraud? Plug the Fraudcast.
You go on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, wherever your podcasting app. Go to the Fraudcast, and you can follow me all through college football season, from National Signing Day to the National Championship, as they say it on the Cover 3 podcast.
Yeah.
And we do all things TCU. It is for degenerates like me.
Okay. And where's your church ministry at?
Lindenwood Christian Church in Memphis, Tennessee.
Okay.
We just celebrated our 180th anniversary.
Wow.
You can find us online at lindenwoodcc.org. To the listeners that are part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, our 2025 assembly will be in Memphis.
Yeah.
And here's my little disciples trivia.
Yeah.
You can come and take a tour of one of the most visited destination sites for tourists in the world, which is Graceland, which was built by a member of Lindenwood Christian Church and sold to this young and up-and-coming artist, Elvis Aaron Presley.
Wow.
I met Grace, for whom Graceland was named after.
Wow. That's some good trivia right there.
Good trivia.
Well, this is a great conversation. Appreciate your time. Always leave folks with a word of peace.
Yes.
May God's peace be with you.
May the peace of the Lord be with you always.
Amen.
Amen.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.